Hello, and welcome to today's web seminar, Selenium Test Automation, Best Practices for High-Performing Implementations, featuring David Dang, Vice President of Automation Solutions at Zenergy. I'm your host and moderator, Beth Romanek. Thank you for joining us today. Before I hand it off to the speaker, let me explain the controls on this console. If you experience any technical issues, please send a note through the question field located beneath the panels, and we'll be on hand to help as quickly as possible. Our responses can be read in the Q&A panel to the left of the slides. This is also the same way to submit questions. We welcome all comments and inquiries during today's event, so feel free to ask as many as you'd like, and we'll answer as many as possible during the Q&A session after the presentation. This event contains polling questions, which you will answer within the slide view. To optimize your bandwidth for the best viewing experience possible, please close any unnecessary applications that you may have running in the background. At the bottom of your console is a widget toolbar. These widgets open panels. The console opens with 3 on your screen: the speaker, Q&A, and slide panels. All of these can be moved around and resized to your liking. If you accidentally close one, click the respective widget to reopen the panel in its original place. Hover your cursor over these icons to reveal labels identifying each widget. Through the Additional Resources widget, you can download the speaker's slides and share this presentation with colleagues. This event is being recorded and will be made available for on-demand viewing. Once the recording is ready, you'll receive an email with instructions on how to access the presentation and slides on demand. With that said, I'd like to introduce and pass the controls to our speaker, David Dang.
Hi everyone, I'm David Dang, and thank you for attending the webinar. The reason that we really want to share some of the information about Selenium is Selenium is a really, right now, a very hot topic in test automation. And a lot of companies are trying to either implement or have implemented Selenium. And there are some pitfalls and there are some best practices that you can utilize to help you with implementing Selenium. So with this webinar, I would like to go over some of that, some of those best practices and ideas. All right, so this webinar, what will it cover? First, it will cover the different flavor of Selenium. So I talked to many companies throughout the years about using Selenium, and a lot of them, what happened was they say, oh, we heard about this great thing called Selenium. We want to implement Selenium, or we want to use Selenium. However, Selenium is an open source tool, and it actually has many different versions and many different flavor of Selenium. So before you actually go out there and try to implement or use Selenium, the first thing you need to know is what are some of the available framework or available toolset out there with Selenium. The next thing is how to plan for your Selenium implementation. Again, Selenium is a framework. It is created by a bunch of really smart people that want an alternative to a purchased toolset for automation. And but like any other thing, you need to plan for it and make sure that you utilize the tool or the framework that will basically get you to the goal that you set for as far as test automation. We're also going to talk about some of the advanced test automation concept and framework that you can implement using Selenium WebDriver. Again, because it is a tool and a framework, you can basically implement whichever way you want to. It's like talking to the development team and say, hey, let's go create something in Java. If you give it to 5 different developers, you're going to get 5 different results back, or just 5 different ways of coding. You want a consistent way to implement Selenium that can be used across your whole QA team, if not your development team and your business user. And then finally, we're going to talk about some of the real-world application of Selenium. Selenium doesn't work for every single scenario out there from a testing perspective. You have to make sure you understand where you want to implement Selenium and how best to utilize it. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So what is Selenium, right? Before that, this is a great quote. Tools can extend or enhance or enable fabulous testing. But by accelerating some action, tools can actually enable us to do bad testing faster than ever. And this is actually a very true statement. I have gone to work with a few companies where they've been implementing Selenium for over 8 months. And the reason for that is, they're building out the tool set in a way where it has too much feature. So instead of actually building tests, they're building feature-based, and that slows down the value that they get back from actually implementing Selenium. So here's a quick poll. What is your organization experience status with Selenium? If you can just answer this quick poll. Oh, great. We have 86% that are considering implementation, which is actually right in line with what we're seeing at conferences and talking to clients. A lot of, it's the new buzzword. It's the new tools. It's the new framework that a lot of companies are considering. So this is right in line with what we're seeing in the marketplace. So what is Selenium, right? It's open source. What that means is it's free. You can go on the web and download it. It has a rich set of features that's already built in. So, for example, if I need to make sure that the calculating the text for an econ application, I can make sure that I'm expecting the text to be 6.75%. It actually show on the amount of the text calculation is 6.75%. So we can actually do a lot of the comparing between the expected result and the actual result. And this also have many options of locating and identifying web objects. So most automation tools out there will go off either a object identifier or object property. Selenium also has that ability to go and interact directly with the browser to figure out the uniqueness of that object. And again, you know, with Selenium, especially with WebDriver, there's actually quite a few different identifiers that you can select. And the core technology is basically interacting with the browser and interacting with the API of, so Selenium, people who built Selenium was basically create a bunch of API and framework that you can basically download and use to basically integrate with your environment, your IDE, so that you can actually code and create scripts. So why Selenium? Why is this thing so big now? You know, back in the days, about 4 or 5 years ago, if you talk about open source for automation, you have fitness. And then about 3 years ago, you had Ruby for water. So why Selenium still around? I mean, Selenium's been around for quite a few years. The main reason is there are a lot of traction between development team and QA team that utilize Selenium. And the main thing is it's free, it's continually evolving and growing. What that means is whenever there's new technology or a new way of doing things, people are figuring out a way to actually have the frameworks that will interact with those objects. There are also different ways to develop and run tests. In the old days, or not the old days, if you work with license tools, basically for every PC or VM you have, you can run a single instance because of licensing agreement and all that stuff. Selenium actually lets you run multiple instances of multiple tests on a single PC or VM, which really gives you a lot more bandwidth as far as testing standpoint. And a big one here is that the test can be translated or be programmed using different languages. Java, Ruby, Python, C#. The main thing here is, or my advice here is that we typically try to stick with Java and Ruby. The main reason we like to stick with those two languages is because they have the biggest user community. The bigger the user community, the less that you have to do coding to get some of the feature you need. So for example, if you need to interact with the database and you need to write some query to query against a database, if you're doing it in Java or in Ruby, probably someone already has done that and already have created those classes that you can reuse, so you don't have to code it again. But if you're using, for example, Perl or something like that, there might or might not be that feature already built out for you. So again, we typically like to stick with Java or Ruby because the user community have the largest user community. All right. Now, what are the three main flavors of Selenium? So whenever I talk to companies and they're like, oh, we want to implement Selenium, I always ask them, well, which flavor of Selenium are you thinking about implementing? there are a lot out there. There's Aussie, Selenium Aussie, which is sent the remote control. Those are some of the older ones, like Selenium Server. But the three main ones right now that most companies use is the Selenium IDE. And I'm going to go into a lot more detail on what the Selenium IDE do. There's also the Selenium WebDriver. And WebDriver is the main one that most companies that are thinking about implementing Selenium will use. It allows you to basically do a lot of scripting and coding to bypass a lot of the hurdles that you encounter for test automation. And again, we can go into some of that detail. And then there's also Selenium Grid. And basically, Selenium Grid will basically act as a distributor. So if I have multiple PC or VM and I want to distribute my execution, I can use Grid to kind of direct the traffic to those PC or VM. Some company actually even buy what they call a Grid server and actually segregated the server into multiple instances and actually run multiple tests on each of those instances. So again, it gives you a lot of flexibility and the ability to run tests concurrently and then also distributed. So let's talk about the IDE. What is it? It's an integrated development environment. It's basically a Firefox add-in. So what you do is if you go to selenium.org, download it, it will actually download it as a Firefox add-in. It's basically allow you to do record and playback. So for someone who's new to automation, this is a great learning tool. You can go out there and basically say, well, I want to record a script and then play it back to see how it works. Why do you want to use the IDE? There's a couple of reasons. One is to create really quick bug reproduction scripts. So let's say that I'm in production support or I'm in QA and someone sees a defect and reported a defect. I want to go out there and record that and play back in 5 different browsers to make sure that that defect are being seen in all the browsers. That's something that you can do with the IDE. It also helps you with doing automation as far as using WebDriver. So when you actually use WebDriver, you're coding. There's no longer a recording mechanism in WebDriver. So let's say you're coding and you realize, ooh, this web object, I'm not sure if I should use name or CSS selector, which is the identifier of that object. So what you can do is you can just use the IDE and record it and see what the IDE picked up. And the IDE might pick up the name to make it a unique identifier. And then you can say, well, I'm going to mirror that in my WebDriver script. And then the other reason that you might want to use IDE is if you're on an agile project and you know that you need to just basically type in the URL destination and test a functionality for that sprint that you're doing, what you can do is just basically record little script, but what I call functional script, that basically we call it disposable or throwaway script, because after that sprint, we might or might not ever use that script again. It's a quick way of doing testing because, again, within a sprint, I might test that functionality 10 times. Why do I manually test that 10 times? I record a script one time, rerun it. If it failed, no big deal. Let me look at it. Okay, I re-record it, and then I run it the next 3 times again. It's basically aid you in manual testing and let you test it a little bit faster. But in that instances, you are really not doing what we call end-to-end testing, which is following a business process flow. In this case, we're just doing what we call functional-based automation testing. All right. What are some of the limitations? Like anything in this world, there's also always pros and cons. Some of the limitations can only test on Firefox. All right. What that means is, you know, the script that you created in the IDE, it will only run in Firefox unless you convert it into WebDriver, which we will talk about in a second. You can't really put in programming logic. So I can't say that if the payment type is credit card, fill out this 3 fields. If it's, you know, PayPal, fill out this 2 fields. You don't put too much programming logic in there. And then also, it's very difficult to create complex tests. So what I mean by complex tests is, for example, if you have an e-commerce application and you want to go out there and search for computer, the computer that you pick today might not exist months from now, right? Because the stock is already changed, the database changed, the product detail changes. So for those kind of tests where you need to run it for multiple years, the IDE is probably not the best way of approaching or using for long-term automation. So in automation, we always talk about, for long-term use versus short-term use, which is, we will get to that part in just a second. Now, the IDE does give you the ability, as I mentioned before, for you to convert what we call a recorded script into Selenium WebDriver. And again, Selenium WebDriver is a totally different framework that you can use. But it does let you go there and convert it to WebDriver script. And once you convert it, you basically have a recorded script in WebDriver. One thing that you should, again, you can approach Selenium or using WebDriver even, in many different ways. The main thing is, how do you manage Selenium so that it's maintainable, it's expandable, and it also allows the user to easily use the automation. That's the criteria that we always have, is to make sure that we can achieve those criteria. How about Selenium WebDriver? What is it? It's basically a robust web-based API. Right? It's a successor to Selenium RC. It's actually a huge improvement over RC. When we were using Selenium RC, we see a lot of inconsistent results. What I mean by that is the script run one time, and then tomorrow, even though we have everything set correctly, it won't run correctly the next day. WebDriver really takes a lot of that inconsistency out and gives you a much more reliable and stable test. Now, what it does best, it creates basically browser-based automation, and I would probably extend that to better cross-browser based. As you know, many companies now are relying heavily on the web for a lot of their businesses, and just testing in IE or just testing in IE and Firefox is not enough. We want to make sure we have true coverage across multiple browsers. So companies are using a lot of analytics to figure out where their user base is, and so if you know that 20% of your user is using Safari, you might want to test Safari quite a bit because, again, a lot of your business is coming from that browser. So Selenium WebDriver actually allows you to test across quite a few browsers: Safari, Chrome, IE, Firefox, and then there's also a couple other drivers for smaller browsers. And it also lets you scale and distribute tests across many environments. What I mean by that is, most companies don't just test in one environment. Most companies have dev environment, sometimes integration environment, sometimes QA, staging, production environment. We want the ability to have the script to run across more than one environment so that you have thorough testing across environments. So every time there is a code promotion into a new environment, you want some sort of automation test to kick off and run so that you get the true coverage that you need to ensure that the code is still working from one environment to the next. All right. So here's an example of the WebDriver API that you can use. It makes direct call to the native browser. So if I want to test on IE, for example, I just have to make sure I download the driver. And once I download the driver, I can set the driver to the browser I want. And then now every test will basically go off that browser as far as testing standpoint. All right. Here's another little quick poll that you can have. All right. What current tools are you using for automation? All right. Wow. This is pretty cool. It looks like it's pretty even, but licensed purchase tools are still up there, which is exactly what I expect. Just to give you a little bit of a story here, my last 3-4 clients, what they did is they have RFT or UFT, and what they did is they actually slowly converting their web-based automation over to Selenium. So they're actually using two tool sets to kind of offset you know, the RFT and UFT licensing costs and all that fun stuff. All right, so let's move on. So test automation consideration. All right. So again, now we're ready. We like Selenium. We like Selenium WebDriver for that matter. We really want to implement Selenium. What are some of the stuff you really need to think about? Selenium is kind of funny automation tools because a lot of the purchase automation tools out there, the sales cycle for those are basically targeted at QA groups. Selenium, on the other hand, I'm seeing a lot of what I call changes to that viewpoint. A lot of the Selenium are spearheaded by development teams. They hear about it at conferences or through their channel, and they're like, hey, QA, why are you guys not using Selenium? It's free. It works with Java. We're a Java shop. We should be using this thing. So, you know, there's a lot of spearhead with development team, you know, pushing for Selenium usage. And there's also a lot of QA teams that are saying, hey, there's got to be a better solution to some of our testing that we need to do. So it doesn't matter where the request is coming from. What we really encounter is what are some of the stuff you need to consider when you implement Selenium, right? So two approach that we see a lot of Selenium projects being successful. And again, there's a many different approach out there. But most companies that implement Selenium WebDriver and are successful, they typically use either what we call page object approach or a keyword action-based approach. And don't worry, I will go into a lot more detail on that. Another consideration that a lot of companies doesn't take into is the technical resource of the people who's going to be implementing Selenium. If you buy a license to like RFT or UFT, there's a beautiful front end, right? There's all the feature, most of the feature, not all the feature. A lot of the features already built in. And so from a usability standpoint, it's slightly easier to use. However, because Selenium WebDriver, for that matter, is a framework, you literally need to know Java, need to know Ruby, need to know Python to actually code the script up. So there's no beautiful user interface that you can point and click or drag and drop. It is something that you actually need to code, which require a higher technical resources. The other thing you need to look at is short-term versus long-term goal. If your goal is to basically using Selenium in an agile environment during a sprint, then yeah, use the IDE, quick script, disposable script that you can create very quickly, very easily, and then you can throw it away. However, if you want to create tests, your regression test or your integration test, that will, you know, span across 3 to 5 years. You need to make sure that you have a strategy that will basically let you expand and maintain tests relatively easily. I gone to a few companies where they spent more time every release or every sprint updating the automation script than actually running them. That is not what the goal of automation should be. Your goal of automation should be, hey, whenever there is a build, I have a suite of smoke tests that I can run, kick off, tell me yay or nay right off the bat, and then I have what we call full regression that I run that will give me the result of 800 end-to-end regression tests. And then, of course, test data strategy. If you have been doing test automation, you know that test data strategy is something that might be an afterthought, but it's the biggest hurdle that you have to overcome. What I mean by test data strategy is, how do I run my tests over and over and over again without having to manually intervene every time I run to change data? An example of this is, let's say that I have a human resource application that, you know, create a new hire. That new hire, once it's in the system, you can't put that person back into the system again, right? Because again, if you put it back in the system should say, hey, you know, that person already exists, okay? So the test data strategy is you're coming up with either algorithm, a way to query the database, the way to create data, so that you can run your tests over and over and over again. All right. Here are some more consideration. Agile versus waterfall methodology. We talked a little bit about Agile. If you're doing Agile, you're probably going to need to create smaller script and big script, okay? And then also, from a waterfall standpoint, usually waterfall, you have actually a QA or a testing cycle. You know that during that testing QA cycle, you're going to be able to run your smoke test, your partial regression, your full regression. So again, it's the release frequency that is going to be impacted by how you're going to design automation. Test environment, which you also touch on, running in multiple environments. I actually have a couple of clients that run their Selenium automation in production in what we call non-destructive tests. What I mean by non-destructive tests is tests that doesn't actually update the database. So for one of the clients, we do e-commerce, and we have tests that run in production, but we want to make sure that we're not actually putting in an order because, again, the order might actually flow down to WMS and actually try to fill that order. So we actually just test where we basically do product search, product detail, add to cart, remove from cart, those kind of functionality that we know that it won't be disruptive in the production environment. Another thing that you need to consider is the maturity level of the application under test. If you're developing a brand new application, never been tested, it's probably not the best to do the end-to-end automation right after that. You want to do more of the disposal automation first, and then after you manually test a lot of the stuff and build out your automation. Because anytime there is a change or development change to the application, there's probably going to be a change in automation. So think about if the application hasn't been released and it changes up to the date of go live, your automation is going to have quite a bit of maintenance to keep up with those development changes. And then finally, the level of testing that you need to consider. What I mean by level of testing is, am I really care only about functional testing? Do I only care about integration testing? Do I only care about business flow testing? Do I want to do layout testing versus data validation testing? Do I care about backend updates? Do I care about database updates? All that will need to be taken into consideration when you go out there and use WebDriver. A lot of the feature set, like I mentioned before, might not already been developed. So your timeline of implementation of Selenium will be extended if you know that, oh man, I got to make sure that I run a job first. The job will update, the SQL Server database, and I have to query the database to get the information. That will extend the timeline from an implementation standpoint. All right, so let's talk about, or go into a little bit more detail about the two approaches. Again, there's many approaches out there. Which one is right for you? To be honest, I don't know. It's a matter of matching up your environment and all those test automation considerations, and then figuring out what are the approach, or what is the approach that best will fit into your situation. Now, that being said, even with this two approach, page object and keyword action based, there are many variations of this. So this is more of a high-level talk. I have seen page object where we combine multiple pages into one, which is what we call modular. I also have seen keywords that are on the step level or keywords that are on function level. Again, it's just a different way of looking and implementing the approach. But the page object, basically, what it does is it keeps the WebDriver interaction in one page, in one place. So each page, basically, it's a class. And within each class, you have action that you can do within those, which is methods. And if there's any changes that you need to update, you make the changes in one place. Usually the object definition or the object identifier is within that page. So if I know that an object identifier or object property changes, I just have to go to that page and update the object. It also allows the script writer to focus on the text and not the detail of the WebDriver interaction. What we mean by that is the person who developed the class, right, needs to map out everything. But as a user of the page object, I really don't care if it's already mapped or not, as long as I know that it does what I want it to do, which is going through that page and interact with the object. So as a test builder, I don't have to be as technical as the one who built the class. So you can have a separation between what we call automation engineer versus automation user. All right. So here's an example of lock-in. Everybody know lock-in because most applications you use have lock-in. But as you can see here, we have a class called lock-in page. And inside here, we already identify the object identifier or object property that we need to use. So in this case here, the username locator equal to by ID. So we know we're using the ID to uniquely identify this. And then within this, we have method that we actually call to interact with each of the objects. All right. Here is a high-level framework concept when you build out a framework. All right, using page object, you will have what we call, you build something called the test manager. Basically, it manages the tests, because the tests you want to run, you don't always run the full suite of tests. So you need a test manager to basically manage the suite. And then from the suite of tests, you manage the tests. And from there, you will actually have, you actually kick it off the test and interact with the application itself. And then you also need reporting and logging. For the most part, the Selenium framework, the reporting it has is very limited. So a lot of the time we actually integrate it with ReportNG to do some of our reporting to make it a little bit better. Also for logging purposes, we use Log4j, if it's Java, to actually do some of the logging. But you can see how the test manager can actually interact with Jenkins. And the reason a lot of companies interact with Jenkins is because most companies that have continuous integration will either use some kind of tools, and Jenkins is, again, it's open source. It's actually a really good tool, and we integrate it with Jenkins so that anytime there's a build, it will automatically kick off the automation suite that we want to run. And we can set up multiple suites. We set up a suite called smoke test, and then partial regression and full regression, and that kick off the test, which kick off their interaction with the application and report back the result. And as you can see, there's actually a dotted line from the report back to Jenkins, so that we can actually report back to Jenkins. All right. Here's another approach called keyword action based. Keyword action based take a little bit different viewpoint of how you want to do test automation. Instead of having code directly related to a page, the keyword action-based approach say that we should create an engine to interpret the action that the manual tester writes. Now, the benefit of this is if I need to test a lot of different web pages, if I use page object, let's say I have 10 websites that I want to test. Each website have 100 pages. Now if I use page object, I will have 500 page objects to manage. Versus if you use keyword action based, you build an engine, and the engine doesn't really care what website are you testing, as long as it interprets each of line of this so-called manual test step. So in a keyword action based approach, what you do is you write manual tests very strictly according to the actions that you want to do within each step. And then from there, what you do is you will create the engine to interpret each line and create the Selenium step during execution for each of the manual steps that you created. All right, so here's an example where it actually go in here and actually get the object, the action, and data. And then from there, it actually call a class called the test case class, and it interprets each of those statements. And then from there, it actually created the Selenium test step. All right. Here's an example of the keyword framework. You have the test cases. You have the engine, which basically contains the biggest piece on the engine here is actually the runtime object, which is the WebDriver piece to actually generate the Selenium script to actually execute the step. And then you have the object map. You need an object map is because this is an interpretive engine, we want to externalize the object identifier, so if there's any changes, we can update those very quickly without impacting the engine itself. And then, of course, you have logging. and report and dashboard. So this is kind of how you need to implement Selenium WebDriver if you want to implement a keyword action-based approach. All right, I talk about managing objects. So with a lot of the implementation we do, we externalize our object map or object identifier and give it an alias inside the manual test cases, that little Excel you see, because for a manual tester to write those manual steps that can be interpreted into automation, it would be very hard for them to say, hey, go find the ID of this object and type it in there. They'd be like, what are you talking about? But if you say, hey, for the object name, type in username, whatever you see on the web page, you type that in, that becomes an alias where we can look it up in the object map to figure out the object identifier we need to interact with that object. It's make a whole lot more sense for the manual tester. And again, the goal of the keyword approach is that you can support multiple websites with one engine, and the other goal is to have non-technical people writing quote-unquote manual tests / automated tests at the same time, and then basically having a smaller team to maintain and enhance and develop the engine and the all the pieces of the engines. Here's another quick poll. What resource types are available within your company, or do you plan to use to implement your Selenium test automation strategy? Check all that apply. First, okay, let's see. Automation engineer, that's good. All right, so it looks like 34% automation engineer, 24% technical automation lead, 23% non-dedicated automation personnel, and 16% automation architect. So it's kind of right in line with what we are seeing in a lot of the companies we work with. The non-dedicated automation personnel, that percentage, 24% right now, it's right there. We typically like to have some dedication, maybe not full-time, but it's much easier when you implement a Selenium framework or a WebDriver implementation using some dedicated resources. All right, so real-world Selenium. All right, what is real-world Selenium? Selenium doesn't work for everything. It works for basically standard HTML and the DOM structure. Okay, if you have a web application that have tons of Flash and stuff like that, it interact with it somewhat, but it's not going to be great for automation. All right. If you need to work with applications that have AJAX and JavaScript, it's still very doable. And we actually, we actually work with quite a few applications or web applications that have AJAX and JavaScript. And it just needs a little bit more coding to get around some of the custom stuff that you will see, custom object, basically object that doesn't identify themselves as true web object, like standard HTML. Now, one thing that Selenium is not good for, it doesn't work with what we call embedded application on web browser. So if you have an application like Siebel, SAP, PeopleSoft that embed itself on a web browser, when you go and actually try to use Firebug to look at it, it actually doesn't see a lot of those objects at all, other than the login window. So for those embedded applications, it's probably better, or you probably still have to go back to the license purchase stuff. Another example I can give you is, if for some reason your testing require both you working with a web application and a client server application at the same time. So for example, let's say my web admin is actually coded in a client server application, but I need to change my web admin stuff so that I can see it on the web. Selenium will only be able to probably work with the web side, not with the Windows side, because it only works with browser. Okay. Another thing is if you are testing client server, mainframe, all those applications that are non-web and or embedded web, you're probably still going to have to go back to a license. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm working with quite a few clients right now where they are strategically identifying area they can use Selenium, and then area where they still have to use license tools like UFT or RFT. All right, so automation ROI. I know this topic is a little bit off of Selenium. However, it is one that I know that most managers or directors are very interested in. As the poll showed, a lot of you guys are thinking about implementing Selenium, WebDriver probably. So one way to actually understanding the return is to track the return. So for us, it's actually critical that we track our return on investment, which is how much money we have to shell out. Now, well, we don't have to shell out for the framework of the tools. Selenium is free, right? That is very true. However, to get the technical expertise, to have the learning curve, to put a framework in place or an approach in place, a lot of times that's not free. So how do you track that? You have to make sure that you track your return on investment. And there's actually a few ways of tracking that. One is just basically simple ROI calculation. There's a percentage calculated in terms of monetary saving that test automation provides. What that means is I know that, manually, I know it takes me 20 minutes to run a test case, right? If I automated this test case, it will take me 1.5 minutes to run it in Selenium. That's my saving right there. So simple calculation, if I know that I have a regression suite of 800 tests, I automate 70% of them. And again, the reason I say 70% is you don't want to spend the time automating 100% because some tests are not worth automating because it's too expensive to automate. Another way of calculating ROI is efficiency, right? How automation will benefit in terms of saving time to market. So if I know that every time I have a build or a release, it takes me a week to regression test versus, I buy 10 VM, right, and I run my 800 tests, and it takes 2.5 hours to run it, or 3 hours to run it, I have a efficiency saving where I can say, you know what, it takes me less time to test this, which means we might be able to put it in production a little quicker. Another one is reduction of risk. What I mean by reduction of risk is, so here I am implementing Selenium, right? I know that I don't have time to test everything in this world, especially manually, right? So manually, let's say I have a week to test, and I know that I can only run, with 2 resources, I can only run 150, 200 tests. But with Selenium, I can run more regression tests in less amount of time, which means I have better coverage, which means if I use the industry standard of about 1% regression defects, right, 1% of 200 is only 2, no, all right, versus, I run 800, which is 8, which means I found 6 more defects if I run full regression versus, as far as manual testing versus automation. There is my coverage or risk reduction saving that I can calculate. So all those take into effect on how you want to use automation. All right. But the main part about implementing Selenium is first you need to know what you want to use. Do you want to use IDE? Do you want to use WebDriver? Do you want to use Script? Do you want to use all 3? Right? What scenario you want to use those 2 sets? Okay. If you use WebDriver, you want to make sure that you treat it as a development project. What I mean by that is design, plan, resource, time to implement, all that stuff Okay. Now again, like I mentioned earlier, don't go crazy and say version 1 of my implementation is perfect, because what it will do is it's going to take you 8 months or a year before you develop any tests. What I like to do is I like to follow the software development, which means you have version 1, which you create, let's say, all your smoke tests and some of your high priority regression, and then you have version 2 and version 3, and you keep enhancing the approach to Selenium. The implementation of Selenium WebDriver. Dedicated automation team is essential to success. I know that 24% of you guys say that, you might not have the money or the resource to dedicate resource, and that's, everybody runs into that problem. But what we found is that if you don't have dedicated resource, see if you can get something where it gets you going. Dedicated resource to get you going, then pull back from that and maybe have more of the part-time people doing the maintenance and enhancement and the execution part. But if you don't get over the hump with dedicated resource, it's actually very tough to truly implement Selenium. Does the team have the right skill set? I know that, a lot of Selenium is pushed by development team, which is great. They have all the development experience. They should be able to implement this, no problem. But a lot of time what I encounter with having development team implement Selenium is they are more development-centric versus QA-centric, so they don't think about some of the possibility that you need to, from a QA perspective, have I checked to make sure that this special character works or not works. So if you are using QA to implement this, do they have the right skill set to actually develop, maintain, execute? Another thing is you want to make sure that you understand the different automation approach. We talk about 2 here, and we talked about it very quickly. But to get down to the nitty-gritty, it's actually quite a few distinctions between even within the page object and the keyword action base. How do you define those? And then the last thing that I would advise for people who are trying to implement is there's no one-size-fits-all. I work with multiple clients. We have multiple clients that we work with, and each client, the environment, the application, the way they approach business, the way they approach QA is slightly different. You want to tailor your implementation to your organization needs. So if you don't need, big tests, don't create big tests. If you know that you're going to go out there and use the automation all the time with every build, integrate with Jenkins, we want to make sure that works consistently with the right test data strategy. But that's kind of the conclusion of the presentation. I would start answering questions.
Okay, thanks, David. Before we start the Q&A, remember that you can ask him questions by typing in the field beneath the panels and then clicking the Submit button. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible. We do have quite a few, lots of tool-specific questions. For those we're unable to answer during this time, some of them will be answered offline via email. Okay, so first question we have for you. Will Selenium work with cloud-based applications like Salesforce and Workday?
Yes, it actually works with cloud-based again, it's really not about cloud-based or not. It's more about with how the browser renders that cloud-based website. If it's HTML, JavaScript, things like that, the best thing to do is just go and download Firebug, see if you can so-called spy on those objects within the web page, and then if it show up something that are not too crazy, then it's probably going to work with it. But we don't have any too many problems encountering those that are cloud-based.
Okay, we have another tool-specific question here. Does Selenium work with web apps developed using Silverlight?
That's a good one. The answer is maybe. Some aspect of Silverlight does work with Selenium. However, there's a lot that doesn't. Silverlight uses its own way of identifying or defining objects. So there are some stuff in there that are basically, not so easy to work with.
Okay, and what about, does it work with JavaScript modal windows?
Yes, it does work with modal window. The thing that is tricky with the JavaScript modal window is you're going to keep track of all the modal window that basically gets spawned. So there are some trickiness to that, but again, it does work. What we actually have to do, and this is, it's kind of funny, is whenever a new modal window pops up, sometimes Selenium won't interact with it because it doesn't see it as a new window. What we do is we will get the URL from there and then have the script spawn that window out by itself so that it knows that it spawned the window.
Okay, and you'll all notice also that we're displaying the results from the polls that you all responded to during the presentation, so you can look at those results while we're answering questions here too. All right, next question for you, David. Is your custom web object mapping tool that you've written in Java available via GitHub or some other open source resource?
Not right now. We're actually doing something pretty cool. We're trying to come up with a concept of similar to object spies without using Firebug. So we're actually looking at a way to actually come up with a way where you can actually basically have a web page that basically lets you click on something and basically click on what we consider spying of object, and then click on the object, and it will give you either the ID or the name or the CSS selector or the XPath. So we're working on that, but we haven't. We want to fully kind of test that out before we release.
Okay. And how much knowledge of JavaScript is required for Selenium implementation?
Mostly, if you're using Java, I would say that you want, at a minimum, there's online Java tutorial, of course. You definitely want to go through that. If you have some programming class that you take before, that's very helpful. I typically, for people who are totally new to programming, it takes anywhere between 3 to 6 months to become proficient at it. Again, you can probably start using it after a little bit, but to get through some of the tougher problem and questions and stuff like that, it's going to take a few months.
All right. And are there free framework add-ons available for Selenium, or are there only license-based options?
To be honest with you, there are no real free ones that I know of. I mean, like the page object stuff, I mean, it's really related to the page or the website that you create. And the ones that are licensed, let me just tell you, I have a development background, so I'm a little geeky. So I like to build my own because I'm really afraid of relying on some of that licensed stuff, and then if there's a huge change or stuff like that, the reaction won't be fast enough for me to support my application.
Right, that's great that you can do that. Is it true that keyword and action-based approach is not very friendly to continuous integration, that the spreadsheet input is also part of version control?
It can be. I mean, yes, it can be not as friendly. The way that you have to approach it is, if you're talking about continuous integration, you're talking about a subset of real regression. So what we do is we pick tests inside your regression suite that are critical, of course, because that's a smoke test. But it's only about 10 tests, and within those 10 tests, inside the Excel, we actually create formulas and algorithms to make sure that the information that you have is pretty dynamic, so that you don't have too much problem with continuous integration. Part of continuous integration is still ensuring that your core functionality is still working correctly, and that's what the test's for. If you're building continuous integration with new functional tests, I would not recommend it. I would just recommend using IDE for that matter.
Okay, thank you. What is the framework generating keyword action-based steps?
So again, the whole keyword action base is really based on manual tester writing manual tests that can be interpreted by the engine and use it as an automation. So inside the engine, we basically look at the Excel spreadsheet and find out the objects, find out the action. So let's say the action is input, and you're inputting something into the search field, right? So what we're doing is we know the object, we know the action is input, we know the object class, right, is a web edit. Now we can basically, based on those information, generate the Selenium step, which is basically, performing the the type command into that field.
And what is scriptless framework, and does Selenium support it?
That's a good one. Scriptless framework, basically, it's very close to keyword framework, but with a very pretty front end usually. And again, it's a way of basically saying you don't have to code anything, and everything should work. And again, there are quite a few companies out there that offer that solution. Personally, again, I have a development background, and even though it's scriptless, you're going to encounter stuff that is in your application that needs to be scripted before you can use the scriptless. So I would, if some people love it, some people hate it. I'm one of those in between regarding that.
That kind of goes back to you saying before that you should take at least an introductory level coding course, right? 3 to 6 months to get familiar.
Yes, absolutely. Because again, the scriptless stuff are great for about 80 to 85% of your application, but your application is going to act slightly different in that 15% or so, and that's when you need to know how to get around it.
Okay. And do you find many people using Grid with Jenkins?
Yes, they do. But again, most companies that integrate with Jenkins use it for one or two ways. One is with continuous integration, where anytime there's a bill, or the code is checked in, and there's a bill, pre-bill and post-bill. The post-bill get executed the smoke test. We also use Jenkins as a way to kick off a bunch of tests that basically interact with Grid. So we actually use Jenkins for not only continuous integration from a development standpoint, but also from a QA standpoint. So from a QA standpoint, we do integrate it with Selenium Grid so that we can have the distributed testing.
Okay. And this person says, our testing is performed in a closed, secure network. Will Selenium WebDriver work in that kind of environment without having to reach back to an external site or system?
It should. I'm not sure how the security of your website works, but just put it this way: if you can basically run the tests or run the browser manually, and you can install the framework on like Eclipse IDE or something like that within that environment, you should not have a problem running it in that environment. Now, that being said, one of the funny story I have is, I actually gone to a lot of companies where we try to implement Selenium, and the security team say, well, you can't download it because it's free. You need to buy something and make sure we have a license agreement. So it's a catch-22. We want Selenium, but it doesn't cost anything, so you can't use it.
It's a red flag.
Yes.
Can Selenium test an application on an Android browser?
That's a really good question. The short answer is not yet. There are, for iOS and Android, there are some plugins right now that you can try. However, that being said, there are some plugins that you can use. It's just not very mature. The community really are trying to get some of those feature base in place. Just to lead in from there, one of the stuff that we're working quite a bit with now is actually trying to test iOS and Android app. So what we do is we integrate Appium with Selenium and actually run the test through the Android SDK using Appium as the server or the node server to interact with the app. So there are some solutions to it. It's just not as mature, and we're actually working quite heavily on that front.
Okay, and we'll do one or two more questions depending on how long it takes to cover them. Do you cover using Selenium for testing HTML5 or OpenUI 5?
No, I haven't actually used that yet, so I can't comment on that. I know that those are pretty new web protocol, so I can't really comment on that because I haven't encountered that too much yet.
Okay, well, thank you very much, David. Again, for the questions we were unable to answer, some of those will be answered offline via email. And that ends our event for today. I'd like to thank our speaker, David Dang, for his time, and I'd like to thank Zenergy for sponsoring this event. And also, a special thank you goes out to you, the audience, for spending this last hour with us. Have a great day. We hope to see you at a future event.
Thank you.